Good evening, everyone. A very warm welcome to this webinar. I'm Dr. Devika Chatterjee from Kolkata. As all of you are aware, today we'll be discussing the echocardiography involved in the assessment of aortic valve regurgitation, and the approach we'll be taking is holistic. And we'll be going right from its etiology to the management. We are privileged to have a speaker of national and international repute with us today who needs no introduction. And it is an honor for me to introduce Dr. Rakesh Gupta, who is one of the top cardiologists from Delhi. He was a past president of Indian Academy of Echocardiography, and he is actively involved in all the activities of IAE from the day of its inception till today. He is the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Indian Academy of Echocardiography, and he was also the past president of CSI Delhi branch and past associate editor of Indian Heart Journal. He has many publications in the leading national and international journals of echocardiography as well as of cardiology. Thank you, Dr. Gupta, for joining us today. Now, before I hand it over to Dr. Gupta, I would just like to remind everyone that we'll have our question answer session at the end of the presentation. So during the course of the presentation, whenever a question comes to your mind, just type it in the chat box. I'll select the best questions and propose them to Dr. Gupta at the end of his presentation. So without further ado, let's begin our session. Dr. Gupta, may I request you to start your session?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Dr. Devika, for those words. I'm sure that I'm not meant for all those kind of words. That is just a sheer hard work, passionate for echocardiography. That's what the aim is as on today. And presently, looking at all these kind of things, we need to do something more in echocardiography.
All these cases of interesting and challenging echoes.
I'm thankful to Indian Academy of Echocardiography as a whole for starting these kind of webinars, which are the real need of the hour. People staying at a smaller places, small district towns and villages, they want to learn an art of echocardiography. And in learning that art of echocardiography, Indian Academy of Echo is playing a significant role in teaching them or upgrading them in their knowledge of echocardiography. At the same time, I'm thankful to Madignict also for this electronic support in conducting these programs. And thank you, Dr. Devika, also for introducing me in such a beautiful way. Grateful. Moving on to my presentation, let's say what is the exact anatomy of aortic regurgitation. All of us should understand that we have three cusps of this aortic valve, which consists of a right, non, and left coronary cusp. And those people who are just joining a fresh one in echocardiography, why these cusps are labeled as right, left, and non-coronary cusp was because right coronary cusp gives you a coronary artery of right coronary artery, left coronary cusp gives you left coronary artery, and there's no coronary artery from a non-coronary cusp. And if you look at the cusp as a whole, or aortic valve as a whole, beside these three cusps, we have this sinus of Valsalva. Then we have an annulus and a ventriculo-aortic junction. And on top of that, it continues in a tube kind of a format to form a sinotubular junction also in this over here. And this continuation of a sinotubular junction continues into an ascending aorta. And this is how these aortic valves are placed. This is like looking at the aortic valve sitting in left ventricle where we have all three cusps, the main two coronary arteries. You can see the annulus of the aortic valve and the three leaflets of the aortic valve in normal circumstances. Today is an era of three dimensions echocardiography. How do we perceive these cusps when we look at a three dimensions echocardiography is like, this is how we look at, this is an AML, this is a PML. And when we, not this is the AML and this is the PML. And when we look at these kind of a thing, the aortic valve is sitting on top of it. And that's how we look at the aortic valve in transesophageal 3 dimensions echocardiography. Moving on to classification. There's number of classifications which are available as far as aortic regurgitation is concerned, but I like to spend time on the most important functional classification of aortic regurgitation being proposed by Carpentier et al. And that's what it says. The regurgitation could be type 1, type 2, or type 3. And in type 1, it was normally related to aortic root, aorta dilatation, and cusp perforation. But the cusp motion was absolutely normal. Then the cusp prolapse in type 2, and finally you lead a thickening of the aortic valve cusp in type 3. And in mean to say that whatever we are seeing in our country is a type 3 kind of an aortic disease, that is rheumatic aortic stenosis or regurgitation, what we see in our country. I'll spend a little time on this because that's what helps you in making a diagnosis and subsequent treatment is. In type 1, aortic regurgitation, it depicts sinotubular junction enlargement and dilatation of ascending aortic root. What does it do? When it dilates, it gives rise to a non-coaptation of aortic valve leaflet and subsequently aortic regurg. Type 2 depicts dilatation of sinus of Valsalva. Here is a type 2 sinus of Valsalva dilatation and sinotubular junction. Again, the non-coaptation gives rise to aortic regurgitation. Type 3 depicts ventricular-arterial dilatation and leading to again non-coaptation. And finally, if there's a perforation of aortic valve leaflets, obviously we see a type 1D kind of aortic regurgitations. And that's what is another variety of looking at this functional classification. Type 2, we have a cusp prolapse, very common thing seen in aortic regurgitation, and type 3 I've already discussed, like the most common thing seen in rheumatic fever. On the other hand, we have many other classifications presenting like aortic regurgitation being acute, chronic primary aortic regurgitation relating to almost leaflet involvements, and the chronic aortic regurgitation due to aortic disease per se. And in this, we have a couple of examples would like to show you in a couple of minutes. Beside that, we have 3 different varieties of iatrogenic aortic regurgitation where this is seen very commonly. One is the most important thing what we are seeing day to day in the practice is post-LVAD implantation. Then when we had a TAVR, then we get a mild to moderate aortic regurgitations. And if we dilate a bicuspid aortic valve during the childhood period, especially when the child is not ready for a valve replacements, then we get an aortic regurgitation. Let me show this aortic acute regurgitation. It's a vegetation which is present on this particular part of this aortic valve. And if you happen to look this kind of a thing with severe aortic regurgitation, do we need any evaluation? That's what exactly I say. If you have this vegetation, if you have a severe aortic regurgitation, I don't need any parameter for evaluation. The patient is ready for AVR. Same thing can now very good seen by transesophageal echo 3 dimensions or transthoracic 3 dimensions echocardiography to look at the morphology of these vegetation on which cusp they are involved and which how much thickened of these cusps are. Here is an example for one of the slides from our friends from Chennai talking of this vegetation. Look at the amount of vegetation seen on these aortic valves. They are seen in this aortic valve also. And that's how this vegetation, they're present in aortic valve, giving rise to a severe aortic regurgitation. Then next variety of aortic regurgitation is dissection of aorta. Look, this is primary dissection of aorta involving the ascending aorta itself. And when I teach people in my training programs, I always say, if you happen to look 2 aortic valves, think of dissection of aorta. Always, God has never given us 2 aortic valves. God has given us only 1 aortic valve. And if you happen to see 2, look at this dissection and look at this aortic regurgitation. Again, you might evaluate this aortic regurgitation as mild if you look at these various parameters of aortic regurgitation, which I'm going to show in a couple of minutes. But this is not a mild kind of a variety of aortic regurgitation. Dissections means dissection, and it has to be taken care of immediately. This is another example for dissection of aorta. Look, the dissection proximal you see starting just at the origin of the aortic valve leaflet. Here the dissection is a cytotubular junction, and you can look at the dissection with dilated aortic root, and with this dilated aortic root, you can see severe torrential aortic regurgitation. And now with 3 dimension, you can see a flap sitting over here. That's what the 3 dimensions echocardiography tells you about aortic regurgitation. Next, moving on to chronic primary aortic regurgitation. Chronic primary aortic regurgitation behaves in many formats. This is a slide just loaded from a 12th August on my system. Look, this is an old lady, about 70-year-old lady. She has got both thickened aortic and mitral valve leaflets, mitral annular calcification. And this mitral annular calcification with this amount of a mitral aortic regurgitation and mitral regurgitation classify into atherosclerotic or calcified diseases. Moving on to valves per se. Look at the example of unicuspid. Only you can see one cusp of the aortic valve leaflet with evidence of a torrential AR. And this paper has just been published in JACC cardiology cases with showing a single lumen by multi-modality imaging for aortic regurgitations. Moving on to single cusp, we can see a bicuspid aortic valve with another severe or moderate aortic regurgitation. And look how beautiful we can see this bicuspid aortic valve when we are doing this particular phenomena by transthoracic or transesophageal echocardiography. And this is one picture from my transthoracic echocardiography talking of this bicuspid aortic valve as if we are sitting in aorta and looking at what is the bicuspid leaflet is, and then associated aortic regurgitations. Moving on to this, we can see the 4 cusp of the aortic valve over here, informate and eccentric aortic regurgitation here. So the pathology of aortic regurgitation varies from person to person and what kind of a etiology it is. Here is another example from rheumatic heart disease, the most common thing in our country even today also. Look at the doming of the aortic valve, thickening, restriction cusp motion along with the aortic valve disease, poor LV systolic contraction and both MR and AR. Moving on to now again another issue of calcified. I showed you one previously. Now look at this calcified again presenting with an aortic regurgitation jet. And this calcification has been classified by European Heart Journal in 2013, talking of what kind of a grade of a calcification these people have in aortic regurgitations. Then coming down to aortic disease per se, we have a dilatation of aorta. That dilatation of aorta was because of dissection. And here is a primary dilatation of the aortic root or ascending aorta giving rise to aortic regurgitation. And this is another one example with VSD with aortic regurg. All of us knows that supracrystal VSD have that aortic regurg associated with it. And that can be beautiful seen in this short axis view where we see this aortic regurgitations as well as ventriculoseptal defect. Moving on to these new etiology, which we need to understand, though they are not of much value as far as this session is concerned. Here is an example for iatrogenic AR secondary to LVAD. Look, here is an LVAD sitting over here, and you can see a constant jet of aortic regurgitation. And this is an empiric depiction of the constant jet of aortic regurgitation. Due to LVAD, where there is no systole and no diastole, is a constant flow which is coming back from this aortic valve and being sucked by LVAD and giving rise to severe aortic regurgitation. All of us seen, here is a TAVR or transaortic valve replacement, and which is sitting over here, and we have some small to mild or moderate amount of aortic regurgitations. Then we have another classification of aortic regurgitation based on the structure involvement. It could be valve, aortic root, or valvular apparatus. I'm not going to go into detail of this. I only say that rheumatics still constitute be the most important factor in our country, where the Western world, the aortic bicuspid valve or the myxomatous disease, they plays a significant role. Then this particular scenario of hypertension, many people they present with in our country even today who are elderly people, they have a hypertension, they have an atherosclerotic disease, and they present with dilated aortic root with mild to moderate aortic regurgitation, and rest of these things are pretty rare to see in our country. Then comes another classification of having a disease being from congenital or acquired, but ultimately they come out to the same thing. What is dependent on whether valves or root or aorta, that is what exactly. One more, primary versus secondary. They talk of a primary because of a structural involvement of the valvular apparatus, or secondary because of root dilatation or chamber dilatations. That is what classifications are. But whatever the classification abnormalities are, I would like to say one should stress on looking at the valve leaflets, looking at the ascending aorta, and looking at the sinotubular junction. That's how we look at the severity as well as the type of the involvement of aortic regurgitation etiology. Now comes the hemodynamics. Hemodynamics plays a significant important role in management issues. As I showed you, if we have an aortic dissection, if we have a vegetation, we have an unadopted LV, sudden increase in LV EDP, premature closure of mitral valve leaflet, increased LA pressure, and significant pulmonary edema. On the contrary, if the aortic regurgitation is long-standing, like it develops in rheumatic heart disease, it develops in atherosclerotic valves, it develops with the dilatation of aorta, it develops with hypertension, the LV starts getting overloaded over a period of time. The stroke volume increases and rejection fraction goes up dramatically high. And then the LV starts dilatation, normal cardiac output plus ejection fraction, and then the final downcome starts. I'm going to show this slide in a couple of seconds in how we have a natural history of aortic regurgitation. So initially, if you have a chronic aortic regurgitation, if you have a rejection fraction of 60 or 70, that's nothing abnormal. It means you're seeing the initial part of a chronic aortic regurgitation. And subsequently, if the ejection fraction goes down to 50%, it's the ejection fraction is normal, but it has gone down. It is not normal ejection fraction, is a reduced ejection fractions. Moving on to severity of aortic regurgitation, I said transthoracic echo plays a single first line imaging modality to investigate valvular regurgitation for whatever the causes, etiology, severity, and evaluation form. Then, if transthoracic echo is suboptimal, we should put an emphasis on transesophageal or cardiac MRI. And three-dimensional echocardiography plays a significant role, I'll say. It plays a very significant role in enhancing our understanding of mechanism of regurgitation. It really provides a real-time display of three-dimensional images, and that's particularly eminent for mitral, aortic, and tricuspid valves as well, along with aortic. I showed you a couple of examples in my beginning of my presentation. I'll show a couple of examples when I come later on. When we look at an echocardiographic parameter for comprehensive evaluation of regurgitation, I'll never forget to use my clinical information as for evaluation for these parameters. Let me show what clinical information does it gives me. It tells you what symptoms and related clinical indication. It tells you what height, weight, and body surface of the patient, and then the blood pressure and heart rate. If I am a treating physician, if I do not see my blood pressure of a severe aortic regurgitation and I classify as severe aortic regurgitation, possibly I am not a good physician, or I'm not doing a correct justice to my profession. And how does it behave like? Because if I have to look at these kind of things, I have to look at my blood pressure. If my blood pressure is 120/80, and if I classify this somebody as a severe aortic regurgitation, nobody will believe me when the patient goes to him or her. And this has been amply substantiated by this paper published in Journal of American College of Cardiology in 2020, January. This says, what is the prognostic significance of diastolic blood pressure and resting heart rate in patient who has hemodynamically significant aortic regurgitation? And look at this graph. Very categorically, this shows that if the blood pressure is less than 70, look at their cumulative survival over a period of time. The blood pressure goes down from 70 to 55, this is further goes down. And if it goes down less than 50 or so, the graph is little better. It means to say that if my blood pressure is between close to 70 to 55, my survival is pretty poor as compared to a normal person. And lower the blood pressure for this limit tells you that there is a wide pulse pressure and the etiology is severe. Same is look for heart rate. If the patient has got a heart rate, which is adjusted over here, if the heart rate is 60, this is cumulative survival of these people. And if a heart rate is more than 60, This is the cumulative survival of these people. The heart rate has to be between 60 to 70. We should not rely more on a lower heart rate in aortic regurgitation. We should have a heart rate close to 70 or more, because lesser the heart rate is, the worst is the prognosis, because once we have a bradycardia or lower heart rate, we'll increase the time of a diastolic timing and leading to further deterioration of these subjects of population. And that is one reason we hardly use beta blocker in these subset of populations. In conclusion, it says that diastolic blood pressure, resting heart rate demonstrate robust association with all-cause death, independent of demographic, comorbidities, guide-based surgical triggers, presence of hypertension and hypertension medicines. So next time, if you happen to see a patient of aortic regurgitation, please take his blood pressure as well as heart rate. Moving to imaging of the valves, we have to look at the motion of leaflets, prolapse, flame, restriction, tenting, or valve coaptation. Then structure, how they are thickened, calcified, or vegetation, and look at the annular size or dilatation. Here is an example for this patient over here. We have this LV which is reasonably dilated. Look at the annulus which is dilated or not. Look at these valves whether they're thickened or failed or prolapsed, whether there is calcification or not. And this can be adequately or beautifully seen by parasternal long axis view. And subsequently, that was almost like dilated LV with this kind of a thing. And look at an example of this patient who has got thickening calcification of these valves. LV is not dilated, but aortic root is almost high normal as we compare with the LA. They looks to be almost the same size. So we have to look at these kind of a thing with just 2 dimensions echocardiography. And third comes Doppler echocardiography, the valve. Site of origin of regurgitation is direction in the receiving chamber. And that's done by a color Doppler. And we look at these 2 important things, which I'm going to show you in a couple of minutes. Then come 3 colored Doppler component of a jet, looking at the PISA, then density of a jet velocity signals by CW, deceleration time or a pressure half time, and the flow reversal in descending aorta. This is what the third is. We look at the jet with height oblique LVOT height. And if you look at this jet with height oblique LVOT height, take my words, you have to measure the jet LVOT height during early systole and the regurgitant velocity during early diastole or a little early to mid diastole. So these 2 frames have 2 different sectors of a systole as well as diastole. And this is when we measure the jet with height oblique LVOT height. If it's more than 65 as per 2017 guidelines, is considered as severe. At the same time, we can look at the jet area and LVOT area in a short axis format. Advantage is we can estimate the regurgitant orifice area also. But in this particular fashion, if we measure this particular area, it has to be more than 60% to talk about severe aortic regurgitations. The most important thing which we realize in day-to-day practice is a vena contracta, and that is what the vena contracta is. Look at this flow convergence happening over here. Then we have a vena contracta and the jet area over here. What we were doing in jet with oblique LVOT height was we were measuring at this particular place, not at this particular place. And where do we measure the vena contracta? I always say when I teach, the leaflet through which the blood is regurgitating back during diastole is the vena contracta. And when we look at the regurgitation jet during vena contracta at the leaflet level, if it's more than 6 millimeter in size, that is always suggestive of severe aortic regurgitations. Third comes density of a continuous wave Doppler signals. More the regurgitation, more is the density. And this not only tells you about severity of regurgitation, it tells you about the pressure half time of this regurgitation jet. And if this pressure half time regurgitation jet is less than 200 milliseconds, means faster it gets equalized, it's a severe aortic regurgitation. Most important thing in any evaluation is a continuous holodiastolic reversal of flow in 2 different positions which I like to talk today. One is a proximal descending aorta, or what we see in parasternal short axis view at thoracic aorta. And if you look at this proximal thoracic aorta, it should be holodiastolic reversal of flow with the end diastolic velocity of more than 22 centimeter and a VTI of 22 centimeter. And this is a very strict parameter because what we are seeing today, number of times you can see in false positive holodiastolic reversal of flow in descending aorta. But the most important thing where we see a holodiastolic and which is more conclusive of today looking at is abdominal aorta or lower thoracic aorta, where we should have put a sample volume or a pulse wave volume in descending aorta to look for holodiastolic reversal of flow. And this holodiastolic reversal of flow has got more sensitivity and specificity than holodiastolic reversal of flow in thoracic aorta or parasternal short axis view at aorta. Whatever we saw till now, these are the parameters which has been in practice for a long time. I say like 7 over here, progressive is less than 6. This value is a little variable, but rest of these parameters are almost same thing which I have been reading for the last almost 15 to 20 years. But these are not enough parameters to talk of severity of aortic regurgitation. We have to be more quantitative than more qualitative. And for this, couple of things has happened ever since newer guidelines have come, ever since new things have been formed in aortic regurgitation. And 3 of them are over here. Proximal flow convergence, valvular annular diameter, it means the stroke volume evaluations, and then optimization of left ventricular chamber quantification. Let me take one by one. Here is an example for PISA method. What exactly PISA method is like to show in this slide over here. And I'll try to hold this slide where the PISA is formed. I've been trying this for last couple of days. I'm sure I should, yeah, I got it. Look, this is a slide which shows you whenever the severe regurgitation happens, there's multiple hemispheres which are formed in regurgitation jets. And look at this multiple hemisphere. I'm able to hold this multiple hemisphere in this live format, and we can measure the radius from this point to this point over here, and that's what gives you a radius. And this radius helps you in calculating a PISA. It helps you in calculating the regurgitant volume. And how do we calculate the regurgitant volume is, we look at the radius. Radius is 2 pi r square into velocity of aliasing. If you look at the velocity of aliasing, we move the scale down as we have moved the scale down over here, which is not seen over there. We move the scale down in the direction of regurgitation jet, and this is velocity of aliasing. 2 pi r square into velocity of aliasing gives us effective orifice area, and if you divide this effective orifice area with the peak regurgitant velocity of this AR, that gives you at, here's a peak regurgitant velocity of the AR, and this value gives you a value of effective regurgitant orifice area. This gives you a regurgitant flow, this gives you a regurgitant orifice area, and this regurgitant orifice area is being equal to 2 pi r square into velocity of aliasing is equal to effective regurgitant orifice area into peak regurgitant velocity of aortic jet, and that's give you a regurgitant volume. If you look at this formula, it gives you a regurgitant volume. If the regurgitant volume as per the slide seen over here is more than 60 ml per beat, is considered as 6 significant aortic regurgitations. Well, couple of my colleagues, couple of my friends, they always say, Rakesh, this is very difficult to calculate this radius. Multiple calculation, error is very high. Do you really believe in PISA method? I always say, look, I'm not going to do PISA in every subject. The only question of doing PISA and other 2 methods, which I'm going to say in a couple of minutes, is when I'm looking for a patient who has got a severe aortic regurgitation jet, and I'm not really sure whether this is moderately severe or severe. And that's where I try to utilize my PISA method. And if I do my PISA method regularly, obviously one will become an excellent person, or one will become a perfect person to do a PISA method. Couple of problems with PISA is the shape of the PISA jet. If the jet is eccentric, if you have a multiple jet, and if on top of that, you're not as experienced as Dr. Devika Chatterjee. The solution is you to utilize 3 dimensions method, where you look at a multiple jet by effective regurgitation orifice area and sum them up. And my suggestion to every person who's listening to this seminar is, if you are doing echocardiography, if a patient of aortic regurgitation comes, please try PISA method. For God's sake, do it whenever you get a chance, because when the real chance will come, you'll be one of those experts like Dr. Devika Chatterjee. Next, moving on to a direct calculation of regurgitant volume. This I found in my practice to be more useful rather than difficult. And this we have been doing for a very, very long time. Possibly only thing is we never utilize this method practically in our life. What we have been doing for a long time is we were looking at LVOT diameter, we were looking at LVOT VTI, and then we know how much blood is going out through LVOT. At the same time, we were looking at the mitral annulus diameter when we are looking at a mitral valve. Patients who were coming for stenosis or regurgitation, our surgeon wants a mitral annulus diameter when we're looking at mitral annulus diameter, and we're looking at a mitral annulus VTI. I'm sure all of us have been doing this, but this has been put into practical. The answer is if my this LV is contracting, and my LV is contracting and ejecting blood through the aortic valve, it means I've got a stroke volume at the aortic valve. If my blood is ejecting from LA to LV into the through mitral valve, I'm able to get the stroke volume at the mitral valve. So during diastole, I'm getting two flow, one from a mitral valve, one from the aortic regurgitations. So suppose my mitral flow is 60 ml and aortic flow is 100 ml. So what is the difference? Is almost 40 ml of a regurgitant volume, which is coming back with every stroke in this patient. And that's what has been employed by an intelligent person, I'm sure he must be, to look at these regurgitant volumes. And once we look at the regurgitant volume, of course, the most important thing is, please do it again and again so the chances of error of calculation goes away completely when you really need it. And that has been done adequately looking at these kind of things. One more thing can happen. Regurgitant volume could be what you did. You looked at the stroke volume by LVOT dia and LVOT VTI. But you can also derive this stroke volume from left ventricular end diastolic volume minus left ventricular end systolic volume. And if you reduce this or minus this from a stroke volume of mitral valve, then also you can get a regurgitant volume. So you can get a regurgitant volume by LVOT VTI and LVOT diameter, and at the same time by looking at the stroke volume from end diastolic minus end systolic volume to get a stroke volume. The only problem with this kind of a formulas are they're too much of a calculations as being done with the annulus calculation. VTI would be very easy. I'm sure not much difference would happen in VTI. But if you are calculating the end diastolic volume and systolic volume, you need to have a very good endocardial delineation. And if it's not possible, use 3-dimensional endocardial delineation, or you can use a myocardial contrast. This is what has been said in this direct calculation of a stroke volume. And this says the difficulty lies in measuring the mitral annulus diameter or aortic calcification or aortic annular calcification. That could be a couple of things which will not help in direct calculation of regurgitant volume. On top of that, if you have an associated mitral regurgitations, that is another issue where this formula will be invalid. So in quantitative measures, PISA and stroke volume, what we look finally is the regurgitant volume, regurgitant fraction, and effective regurgitant orifice area. Before that, I'd like to show one slide going back to my original presentation. Original slide is, we should spend time in calculating the optimization of left ventricular chamber quantifications. Because if you have a severe aortic regurgitation, there is no way that your LV has to be normal size. No severity of AR or MR could be there, which is severe without chamber dilatations. And that can be done by 3 dimensions echocardiography or myocardial contrast echo if you have a problem with calculations. So look at these 2014 guidelines. In these 2014 guidelines, what they looked at vena contracta. Then most important thing is they looked at vena contracta. Then they looked at regurgitant volume, regurgitant fraction, effective regurgitant orifice area. And same thing is seen over here. The most important thing is in these kind of things, they looked at all the possible factors like vena contracta, central jet, pressure half time, normal size, enlarged LV, but there was no mention of jet with height oblique LVOT height. Because the jet with height oblique LVOT height is dependent on many preloading and loading and unloading conditions. But in 2017, almost same thing were covered in 2017. Only thing they started putting more emphasis on these regurgitant volume, regurgitant fraction, and effective regurgitant orifice area. And they were able to classify these things more like a instead of 3 parameters, like 4 kind of severity. That was, one was mild, second was moderate, moderate to severe, and severe. And this is very, very important when we have a problem. We are having a problem where some factors are moderately severe, some factors are moderate, and some factors are severe. And this really helps you in deciding whether my patient is ready for intervention or I like to wait for intervention. And I'm going to spend some more time on this particular modality, where how do we differentiate between moderately severe and severe aortic regurgitation. Next comes the point when I do it my transesophageal echo or cardiac MRI. Based on above parameters, we have a 4 group of classification, grade 3 with some overlap of severe of grade 4. That's what I wanted to say. And if these parameters of 3 and 4, they are not clear, then we have a real problems of differentiating it. And if they're clear, we have no problems. When these parameters are contradictory, we use the use of a transesophageal echo or cardiac MRI. Next question comes, how should we depend on PISA and stroke volumes? I like to put a few studies over here. 2013, look at these studies. They looked at color flow jet, vena contracta, PISA method, continuous wave Doppler, pressure half time. And even in 2013, they suffice to say that we should have a PISA method. In 2012, this study would like to say that the people, they took about 20 cases and sent to 20 experts worldwide over to assess the severity of these lesions. And in this severity of lesion, there was no PISA at that time. And when the results came back, they said the most common factor in assessing of severe aortic regurgitation is indexed LV dilatation. Then plus we should have 2 of these parameters like vena contracta with more than 6, holodiastolic reversal of flow in at that time thoracic aorta, and jet with height oblique LVOT height. And with this, they were able to get to almost 100% closely like these people, they belong to severe aortic regurgitation. That was 2012. And in 2018, even the Journal of American College of Cardiology did not talk of a PISA at all. Dilated LV, yes, vena contracta, holodiastolic flow, jet with height, severe aortic regurgitation. If it's not there, it's either moderate or mild aortic regurgitation. But another study talking of the pulse wave Doppler recording the proximal descending aorta in patient with chronic aortic regurgitation along with the cardiovascular magnetic resonance categorically said that if you happen to see a velocity time integral of 22 centimeter or more, or an end diastolic velocity of 20 centimeter or more, which I said earlier, in descending aorta, you are likely to see a very high chances of a severe aortic regurgitation. But if we go to the guidelines, guidelines always talk of PISA method for the severity of evaluation, especially when we talk of differentiating moderately severe to severe aortic regurgitations. So in guidelines, we have to look at all these factors, plus we have to use PISA to look for severity of aortic regurgitations. Moving on to transesophageal echo, very good imaging modality which needs to be evaluated when we are looking at people for aortic regurgitation. As we know, transthoracic is the first modality, transesophageal, when we need to do a more elaborate evaluation and or when we are in grade 3 or grade 4, when we cannot differentiate moderately severe to severe, we need to have a transesophageal echo. And how do we do that? We look at a vena contracta in a zoomed up view. We looked at a short axis area of regurgitation jet, and both on top of that, this modality is very useful for identifying the cause of aortic regurgitation. As you see, which we could not say by transthoracic echocardiography, patient presenting with severe aortic regurgitation had vegetations which were not seen easily by transthoracic echocardiography. And this was very capitally seen by transesophageal. And now there's no doubt that patient has got an aortic vegetation with severe aortic vegetations, and that is what the role of transesophageal echo. And on top of that, lately, we cannot do anything without transesophageal echocardiography. If we are doing a surgical evaluation for aortic root surgery, valve sparing aortic surgery, if we are doing TAV or other process, look, we have to have a transesophageal echocardiography during the procedure. I'm sure nobody is utilizing us before the procedure, but time will come when we're more useful during the procedure, before the procedure. I cannot go away without talking of the utility of CMR. I say when you are not sure about transthoracic echo, go to transesophageal. Even then you are not really sure, go to cardiac MRI. Suboptimal images, utilize CMR or transesophageal. Discordance between echocardiography and Doppler findings between LV enlargement and Doppler measurement, go to CMR or transesophageal echo. Discordance between clinical symptoms, severity of echo by transthoracic. Again, you can go to T or CMR or moderate to severe AR or suboptimal echocardiography for assessment of LV volume and systolic function. You should always rely on cardiac MR. And cardiac MR can really give you a beautiful bicuspid valve, aortic vegetation, aortic root dilatation, and all those kind of things. And sometimes we can see a very good morphology by cardiac MRI, looking at the bicuspid valve and aortic root evaluation by this particular phenomenon. And sometimes when the lesion is multiple, then cardiac MRI could be useful in evaluation for severity. And that's what has been said in this editorial published in November 2019, optimizing the assessment of aortic regression quantity and quality. The optimizing, this says in case of grade 3 plus aortic regression, that is what I said is moderate to severe. When we are not able to say severe, what you should use? Issue of holoristic reversal of trend abdominal aorta is more reliable. Assessment of transesophageal echocardiography is more reliable. Assessment of regurgitation fraction by transesophageal echo as well as cardiac MRI is very, very important in this subset of patients to classify somebody as a lesion which is interventionable versus non-interventionable. Then only few factors which happens, and still there's some gray areas for as far as aortic regurgitation and CMR is there. The difficulty in defining the CMR threshold for grading of AR. Then the regurgitant fraction, we have not able to see what exactly the regurgitant fraction by CMR is useful to classify them as severe, 35 or 40. And when do we say 15 or 20 is mild or less? And that some gray areas are still present in cardiac MR. But I'm sure when we use transesophageal echo along with cardiac MRI will come out very beautifully in a lesion assessing of aortic regurgitation, severe versus progressive severe. Then comes prognostic role of exercise and strain imaging. Decision making in asymptomatic aortic regurgitation in the era of guidelines, incremental value of significant and exercise dysfunction. Very beautiful study published in 2014. What exactly did? They looked at LV strain at rest and after exercise. Similarly, they looked at RV strain at rest and after exercise, and they looked at exercise TAPSE. That is the most important thing. And on top of that, they were very categorical. If the left ventricular end diastolic dimension is less than 70 or less than 50, there we should not expect a severe aortic regurgitation. And this is how they present it. Look at this line over here, resting LV dysfunction and exercise LV dysfunction. Both of them are negative. They're very high. Surgery-free survival chances are pretty high. If the resting LV dysfunction is not there, but it develops after exercise, this is what the graph says about it. And same is for resting LV dysfunction, which was present earlier and increased, and this is the surgical free survival later on. So if you happen to do a resting LV dysfunction is not there and you subject a patient for a stress and LV dysfunction appears, this is the patient who is ready for surgery. Same is for RV dysfunction. No resting dysfunction, RV before and afterward. Normal RV function, and with exercise it deteriorates. Here's a graph line. Resting is RV dysfunction is present and subsequently deteriorates further. Here is a graph line, surgery-free survival. And same thing has been talked about the TARPSE, and talking of the TARPSE is if somebody develops a reduced TARPSE after exercise, that's a poor LV systolic, a poor outcome of these patients. Next comes incremental prognostic utility of left ventricular GLS in asymptomatic patient with severe aortic regurgitation with normal ejection fraction. This study has very beautifully elicited that with a median cutoff of 19%, category said if somebody has got a GLS of more than 19%, this is the survival graph for these people is. If the GLS is less than 19%, this is survival graph of these people. This is basic on the basis of resting GLS people. So if you have a good GLS, it means they have a better survival versus whoever the GLS are less than 19.5, they have a poor survival. And same thing was said for freedom of survival after surgery with this GLS. Another paper, continuation of the same thing, long-term outcome of the aortic valve surgery in patient with asymptomatic chronic aortic regurgitation, preserved ejection fraction. And they followed the same patient over a period of time. And they said, if you have a GLS of 19.4 or more, then you have a good outcome. But if you wait for these people to develop a GLS which is low or poor GLS, it means their surgical outcome would be poor over a period of time. So this is what the graph is. As their GLS goes down, despite being normal ejection fraction and asymptomatic aortic regurgitation, their poor surgical outcome is present in these subsequent populations. And lastly, this paper just published about a couple of weeks back as editorial comments. They always talk, look, exercise and stress, they can really unearth patients who are in compensated stage of aortic regurg. They stop working and they adjust their life to a large extent. If we put them on a stress and look at their strain values, possibly we are able to detect that these people are ready for surgery. Coming to natural history of these people, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. Aortic regurgitation, as we know, this is indications for aortic regurgitation surgery. But this paper published in 2019, talking of the chronic aortic regurgitation, asymptomatic with normal LV function. How did these people behave? These are three people who have done this surgery, Tornos, Bono, and Borer. They're talking of these kind of things over a period of time. Here is a time over a period of years. Here is the percentage of a survival patients over a period of time. And if you look at these people, the cumulative mortality of these people, they ranges from almost 8 to 10% every year. To begin with is 5, then it's become 10, then it's become 12 to 15. And that's how they behave. Almost 30% people, they disappear at the end of 10 years, asymptomatic chronic aortic regurgitations. Some says it's 36 and some says almost 40% of people, they disappear. Despite of these people, somebody had symptoms which they developed. The endpoints are somebody remains asymptomatic LV dysfunction and some have sudden deaths. This is another slide talking of the survival of after aortic replacement for aortic regurgitation, and that's one group A, where we talk of ejection fraction and end-systolic diameter after surgery and their survivals. I'd like to put one important very slide which I just borrowed from Dr. Sunil Srivastava. Look, if you look at the natural history, how the really onset happens. If you look at the onset happens is the onset of severe aortic regurgitation. Everything is good. But once they develop a LV dilatation where the ejection fraction goes up high, even that stage is pretty good. Once they start developing a LV dysfunction and they become symptomatic and their falls comes rapidly. It means to say that we have to pick up those people when they're asymptomatic and their LV is dilated. So what is the most important thing in natural history of this severe aortic regurgitation? It's LV dilatation. And we should be able to pick up these people when LV dysfunction has not set in or symptomatology has not started. Coming to a couple of things and closing down my session, it has to be a team effort as far as management issues are concerned. As I said in the beginning, indication, acute vegetation, acute dissection of aorta. There is no way talking of a holding or assessing for the severity of lesions. Early surgery significantly reduces the mortality. And this is one graph published from American College of ACC and AHA in 2014, talking of indications of aortic valve surgery. I'm not going to go in detail of that. I'm going to say that symptomatic severe aortic regurgitation means, if you go back to this slide borrowed from Dr. Samir Srivastava, symptomatic severe aortic regurgitation is a class 1 indication for aortic valve surgery. On top of that, asymptomatic aortic valve rejection with the ejection fraction less than 50%, it means LV dysfunction has started and they're still asymptomatic. That's one indication for a class 1 indication. Asymptomatic severe aortic regurgitation undergoing some other cardiac surgery, we should have them a valve replacement. And these are the few indications for deciding about severe aortic regurgitation. And I'm able to show you what is between moderately severe versus severe in their evaluation. On the other hand, asymptomatic severe aortic regurgitation, ejection fraction is more than 50 and it's normal, a severe aortic regurgitation then is a class 2A indication. LV has dilated more than 50 millimeters and patient is small body size, we can still, some people says yes, some people says no. But if you have a dilated LV, which is more than 70 millimeter, and this is one place where we have a class 2B indications for interventions. I'm sure many people must be thinking, what kind of surgery? Because everybody talks of a tower today. Take my words, there is no single study which till date has promoted transaortic valve replacement for aortic regurgitation. The classical surgery which is being done today is aortic valve replacement, whether it could be a Ross procedure or modified Bentall, depending on the kind of a condition which we have. Or if somebody is good at surgery, there's very high volume centers are there where they try to do aortic valve replacement as a second surgical option treatment. And for this is the kind of a condition where they like to do a AV repair. I have digged out a couple of papers from TAVR for aortic regurgitation. This is one paper talking of JACE ACC 2017 December. TAVR for pure native aortic valve has been discouraged. The absence of extensive calcification of annulus, frequent coexistence with dilatation of aortic root and absence ascending aorta, potential risk of transcatheter valve in the setting are associated with malpositioning due to inadequate sealing, valve embolization, and significant residual paravalvular leaks. In addition, oversizing of transheart valve is an attempt to compensate for deficient anchoring, involves a risk of valve dislocation, conduction disorder, and annulus rupture. AR is usually referred for intervention when the disease is at advanced stage with irreversible reduction of LV function and severe respiratory, severe pulmonary hypertension. This is what this says. Like, we all will refer a patient of aortic regurgitation not in early stage. We only refer when the patient starts having a dilatation or symptomatology. On the contrary, AS is referred much earlier as compared to AR. And this is current management disparity in the care of patient of symptomatic severe aortic regurgitation. AVR is blue and this is sour without. AVR is natural cumulative mortality, and this is after SAVR if we do not do upper surgeries. Last paper safety and efficacy of transcatheter aortic replacement in the treatment of pure aortic, and thus older generation were associated with high rate of disc mobilization, migration, and significant paravalvular regurgitation, but newer generation valve may be of some help. Only place where TAVR has found to be little option, therapeutic option, is people who had an early surgical bioprosthesis for severe valvular disease of aortic regurgitation, and there you can try a TAVR as a second option of intervention in this. In conclusion, I like to say that in the form of severity severity of a discrepancy, use transesophageal and cardiac MRI. Stress test and 2D stain are helpful in early detection of asymptomatic severe aortic regurgitation where they have gone to either LV dilatation or subclinical LV dysfunction. LV dilatation and subclinical LV dysfunction can easily be assessed by two-dimensional stain. And stress test will tell you whether this patient is having a LV dysfunction or RV dysfunction or reduced TAP, say after exercise, to help you in assessing these people. And finally, I like to say management still hovers around surgical valve replacement. It is not in
इस सेमेस्टर तो सोचा था आग लगा दूंगी आग, खैर छोड़ो, सेमेस्टर को ही आग लग गई.
I say how these kids, they really behave well, and listen to this clip very carefully. How beautiful this young girl, I'll say beautiful young girl, which has said these words while sitting at home during vacation, which are extended till September, October, November. Listen to this clip very carefully, just in a lighter moment.
इस सेमेस्टर तो सोचा था आग लगा दूंगी आग, खैर छोड़ो, सेमेस्टर को ही आग लग गई.
Thank you very much for your patience hearing, and I hand over a mic back to Dr. Debika Chatterjee, and we'll have a question and answer session. Can you switch on your mic, please, Debika?
Thank you, Dr. Gupta. As always, it was an extremely insightful presentation. It was really helpful. And as you said, we have to do the quantitative estimation regularly so that we can develop our expertise. That is very much necessary. In my opinion, the quality of a discussion can be best judged by the questions that it raises in the minds of the audience. So let us begin our question and answer session. And today we have a couple of questions lined up for Dr. Gupta. So let me see the first question. Yes, the first question is how to know severity of aortic regurgitation in presence of mitral stenosis.
A beautiful question, how to learn for a severity of aortic regurgitation in the presence of mitral stenosis. Well, this person has asked this question as he must be a very well-known echocardiographer or a cardiologist. Look, when we have a mitral stenosis, all of us understand this particular phenomena is we have a less amount of blood which is coming from mitral valve to LV. And let me just go back and share my slide, and I've got this answer in a much better way. If I show this slide and give you an exact answer, allow me a couple of minutes so that I'm able to show my slides. And these are frequent things which happen in our country. I don't say they don't happen in our country. It happens very common in our country is the MS associated with aortic regurgitations, because so look at these slides over here. I'll just enlarge them. I hope you can see my slides now. Debika's slides are seen?
Yes, sir, I can see.
Yeah, thank you very much. So presence of severe aortic regurgitation with shorter pressure half time of the mitral valve, that is mitral stenosis. This in turn will lead to overestimation of mitral valve area by 30 to 40%. That's what it means by. Second important thing is the answer for all these things is presence of AR will also shorten the mitral valve. In eccentric jet, a reverse can happen with the pressure half time can increase. The solution for mitral valve is polyneuropathy. As far as what happens to aortic regurgitation, the answer for aortic regurgitation will come. We should always measure a vena contracta, and that vena contracta will give you a safety of assessment of severity of aortic regurgitation. And this aortic regurgitation will help you in assessing whether the aortic regurgitation is severe or moderately severe. One important thing which is very true at this particular moment is we may not have LV dilatation. As I was said, that those papers that said severe regurgitation will have LV dilatation, but we may not have a severe aortic regurgitation, LV dilatation in these cases of MS with AR. And we spend time in these people by looking at an AR not only by transthoracic echo. We look at an AR by transesophageal echo to assess their severity of lesions.
Thank you, Dr. Gupta, for the answer. And the second question is, where to measure VTI LVOT or thoracic aorta?
There are two places of measuring LVOT VTI and thoracic aorta.
Thoracic aorta.
Right? Yeah. So LVOT VTI is measured just before the aortic valve in 3-chamber or 5-chamber view by keeping a sample volume at LVOT. That's one. Then thoracic aorta VTI is measured by keeping a sample volume at parasternal short axis view. We go not to parasternal, we go to ascending suprasternal window and look at the descending aorta. And in descending aorta, thoracic descending aorta, we keep our sample volume to look at a reversal of flow by sample volume. This is, let me just go back to my slide. I think should keep my slides open up because that'll be most important thing for showing them again and again. This is where we see a descending aorta. This is suprasternal window. We see ascending aorta, arch of aorta and descending aorta. And when we switch on the colors in this suprasternal window, ascending, arch and descending aorta, look, this complete holodiastolic, almost red color of blood flow is seen. And some of the people now they are putting a sample volume across this red color to show a duration of colors are. But I keep a sample volume at a pulse wave, you can see a holodiastolic reversal. Holodiastolic, through whole of this diastole, there's a regurgitant flow which is present. That's how we look at it. But the most important thing today is we do not spend much time or we do not have much thing. You go to abdominal aorta, you can keep your transducer in abdominal aorta, vertical transducer, index marker could be in either direction. And just behind the IVC, you'll be able to see this descending aorta. You keep a sample volume over here and you get this holodiastolic reversal of flow in descending aorta. Look at the end diastolic velocity is almost more than 20 centimeters and the VTI is almost 22 centimeters over here. And that's how we look at holodiastolic reversal of flow in descending aorta.
Sir, in descending thoracic aorta, if I'm not wrong, we keep the sample volume in and around the origin of the second branch of the arch of the aorta, isn't it, sir?
Yeah, you can keep it a second branch of arch of aorta, or you can keep it distally to, this is left subclavian artery over here, you can keep it in left subclavian, distal to left subclavian artery.
Okay, sir. And the third question is, if the patient is symptomatic, does it make a difference to distinguish between moderately severe and severe aortic regurgitation?
Well, if the patient is symptomatic, if I go back to the slide of a symptomatic aortic regurgitation in natural history, well, if you carefully examine that patient, the patient would be a severe only. When the patient would be severe, if I get me to the slide of that severe aortic regurgitation where patient is symptomatic, it means he has reached to that level of severity of aortic regurgitation with LV dilatation and poor LV systolic function. Here is the onset of symptoms. It means LV is already dilated and LV dysfunction has already set in. So the question of looking at moderately severe or severe does not arise. And still, if you have a doubt, like your regurgitant fraction is less or other factors are positive there, which are not, the correlation of those factors is not there, you can switch on to transesophageal, you can take the help of a cardiac MRI. But as far as I am thinking is, if patient is symptomatic because of aortic regurgitation, yes, we do not need to have a really differentiation between moderately severe versus severe.
Question number 4 is jet width and LVOT diameter.
Mm-hmm.
What are the sites and time of measurement?
It's a very basic question. I said this in the beginning only. I'll go back and show the same slide again. Now look at the jet. First, let's measure the LVOT. This is a systolic frame where the blood is not seen over here, it's only seen a red color. Diastolic frame shows a blue colors or aliasing or turbulent color, not aliasing, turbulent colors. If I have to measure my LVOT, LVOT is hinge point of aortic valve insertions or 2 to 5 millimeter inside. It depends on person to person and place to place. So we look at it early systole, we measure the hinge points. Suppose this is a frozen frame, here is a hinge point of one aortic valve leaflet, here is the hinge point of another aortic leaflet, and this will be the maximum when the aortic valve is in early systole. That's how we measure the LVOT dimensions. Then we revert back to early diastole where the whole of this jet is seen. Then we measure this jet width height over here during early diastole. Very one important thing at this present moment is this Nyquist limit has to be between 50 to 60. This is little over 70 millimeters or 0.70 is a Nyquist limit. This is little more. So this Nyquist limit at 50 to 60 will give you jet width height oblique LVOT height, which is more than 65% suggestive of severe aortic stenosis. Practical problem. What exactly is happening is end diastolic pressure of LV is very small as compared to the systolic pressures. When the jet comes back into the LV during early diastole, there is a whole lot of aliasing present over here. And we say the Nyquist limit has to be 50 to 60. And many times I've seen we are not able to contain that jet with this kind of a Nyquist limit of lower side of a Nyquist limit. I'm going to say something different because that is not there in the guidelines. What I've done in my life is I'll increase this Nyquist limit so that I can contain this Doppler flow jet and then measure the jet width height. I want to say these words is if I increase the Nyquist limit, I'll be underestimating my jet width height because I've increased my Nyquist limit. If my increased Nyquist limit has measured a jet width height and let with LVOT height, which is ratio is more than 65%, despite being underestimated, it means it is severe again. I hope I'm able to give you an answer. And that's what the problem we have faced both when we are measuring a jet width height as well as vena contracta. I'll raise this Nyquist limit. With raised Nyquist limit or increased Nyquist limit, I'll be underestimating the jet width height as well as vena contracta. If that jet width height is more and corresponds to severe aortic regurgitation, then there's no doubt patient is carrying a severe aortic regurgitation.
Here, I think we'll have to remember two things, that jet height and the LVOT height should be measured in the same line.
Correct.
And the jet height should be measured within 1 centimeter of vena contracta down.
Correct. Down.
These are the two things we'll have to remember.
Sure.
When there is a severe air, it's not a problem, isn't it, sir? I mean, problem is when we get a moderate or moderately severe aortic regurgitation.
Yeah, but in those cases, when you get a moderately severe or severe aortic regurgitation, believe my words, putting more emphasis on jet width height oblique LVOT height, please put more emphasis on stroke volumes, regurgitant fraction, regurgitant volumes, and look at dilatation of LV if there is no mitral stenosis which is present.
And question number 5, I think there is a typographic mistake. He or she has written operating AMR cases. It would be AR cases. I'll read as AR. Why there is a separate cutoff line, like 60% or more, that.
Okay, what she said was 60% ejection fraction in MR.
50% for
AR. Look, all these guidelines, they were made by people because they looked at various correlative data. Look, these are arbitrary figures. Nobody devised these guidelines. Even whatever we say the regurgitation fraction is more than 60% or 50% or 30%, they are all based on guidelines. Why 60, why 50? Because people studied that at less than 50% ejection fraction, they had a poor outcome. More than 50%, they had a good outcome. That was the reason. But nobody can argue why these were 50%, why 60% mitral regurgitation. It all based on investigative data of large, randomly generated and studies.
Okay, so question number 6 is, for making a decision of intervening in a case of moderate to severe aortic regurgitation, shouldn't we also pay attention for rising LVEDP, diastolic dysfunction, and pulmonary arterial pressures?
Well, if it's a rising LVDP, we do not have a cut lines or a guidelines how much LVDP will rise or fall. There has to be some guidelines talking about all these kind of things. Same is for pulmonary artery pressures. Because ultimately, when the blood is regurgitating back from LA to LV, obviously you will say that LVDP will keep on rising in this subset of population. I do agree, I'm not denying that at all. But LVDP, suppose is 15, or sometimes LVDP is 20 millimeters of mercury. There is no guidelines to say that rising LVDP and rising PA pressure will give you a severity of aortic regurgitation. Till date, it's not there. Maybe your suggestion is well taken. Because some people listening to these kind of discussions may come up with some data over a period of time.
The question number 7 is, shouldn't we try to choose those patients who are asymptomatic and even with normal EF, but with progressive decline of GLS, although it is not in the guidelines yet?
It is there in the guidelines. You happen to see one of my paper, which I digged it out, and this category says that if my GLS is 19.5, that is global longitudinal strain is 19.5, and if this global longitudinal strain has decreased over a period of time, so these people, they were subject to, there are two group of people were there who had GLS of 19.5, and they opted for surgery immediately, and those people, they subsequently, after 6 months, it is recommended now that people should have their assessment of their severe, moderately severe people to be assessed every 6 months or 1 year. If their GLS goes down, they should be subjected to surgery. That is well there in the guidelines. And on top of that, they said the one more thing. The person who had a normal GLS earlier, 19.5 as a median GLS, if their GLS has fallen down subsequently and they underwent surgery later on, these people, they did poor as compared to the people who did their surgery earlier. And that has been aptly said in these people of long-term output aortic valve surgery in patients with asymptomatic chronic aortic regurgitation with preserved ejection fraction. And this is based on the GLS value of 19% or more, and subsequent follow-up of these people talking of the same thing. Look, I'll read out these things in patients with 3+ chronic AR with preserved ejection fraction undergoing AV surgery, a baseline LV GLS worse than 19% was associated with reduced survival. In a subgroup of patients who returned for 3 to 12 months follow-up examination, persistently impaired LV GLS was increased mortality. And the third line was the people who had normal GLS earlier and after 3 to 6 months or 12 months of follow-up, if their GLS went down further, they had a poor outcome. So follow-up GLS is very good. We should follow up GLS, and that's what I say. But why do we want to really follow up these people when they are, everything is for intervention? Our quest is to persuade the people to undergo surgery as early as possible, because their long-term outcome of survival would be much better if their GLS is normal versus their GLS is worse than 19%.
The next question is, it's a comment, I think. Most of the TAVR studies are done in non-rheumatic settings. Due to thickened nature of pathological aortic valve in rheumatic disease, TAVR may be a lucrative option as TAVR needs an anchor. What study?
I got this question. I could read this question was, he wanted to say that majority of these TAVR studies are done in USA, the people who have got not atherosclerotic disease, like myxomatous kind of diseases are. But mind my words, like TAVR has not been tried, it has been tried in aortic regurgitation. Before that, I'd like to correctly say that when you have an aortic stenosis, is a severe thickened calcified aortic stenosis, and because of thickened annulus, it is able to hold the valves. And if you look at the papers published in the partner 1, 2, 3 trials, the LV dimensions are not very high as compared to aortic regurgitation. Aorta, not LV, aortic dimensions are not high. Normally it's like 2 to 2.2 millimeters. On the contrary, the patient of aortic regurgitation, the worst part, what happens? LV dilates. And when the LV dilates, what happens? The annulus dilates, the aortic root dilates. So obviously the size becomes larger, and on top of these people, they do not have anything for holding. It's not that myxomatous disease. There's nothing to hold this subset of population. The chances of moving these trans heart valves easily or dislocation of this heart valves more easily, and that's what is a possible reason that TAVR is not being taken in a larger studies till date. Maybe over a period of time, the wall morphology will change over a period of time, things will improve, and we may have a TAVR study being done in large study on TAVR being done in aortic regurgitation. At the same time, I would like to say, people have tried to do TAVR in people who have surgically implanted prosthetic valve, because in those cases, their annulus and their aorta root was well prepared to receive the TAVR valve. Third important say, I'll say, the people, when we do a TAVR, we develop mild to moderate aortic regurgitations. So all these things possibly has not led to development of TAVR in population of aortic regurgitation, whether it's rheumatic, myxomatous, annular dilatation, and over a period of time, everything can happen. Today, some people are trying to do a TAVR in bicuspid valves, low risk surgery of aortic valve. And these things are bound to happen, and new developments, new trials may come out with some good literature if we are talking the same thing, aortic regurgitation, 5 years down the
line. The next question is, in borderline cases, in asymptomatic severe aortic regurgitation, should we proceed towards BNP and pro-BNP?
A very good question. Pro-BNP and BNP, it helps in diagnosis, but it helps you more in prognosis. As far as diagnosis is concerned, it has no values. As far as prognosis is concerned, to prognosticate people for aortic regurgitation, it has got a very good value. It's not a BNP, it's an anti-pro-BNP which has got more values. So you can look, somebody who is in heart failure can have elevated anti-pro-BNP or a BNP. But that does not tell you that patient is moderately severe or severe, because if LV is dilated, it will likely to release from the system. But if anti-pro-BNP is constantly rising, it means there's poor prognosis which is correlated with it. That's what is available in the literature even today also.
The next is, if the patient has eccentric AR jet, how we can measure the severity of aortic regurgitation?
Very simple. Eccentric AR jet means it's not difficult. Majority of time, our aorta is eccentric, in the sense we do not have a horizontal aorta. So we try to adjust our aorta in such a fashion or that it becomes easily seen or measurable, or on top of that, you can adjust your imaging plane in such a fashion that you are able to measure your vena contracta. To tell you two important things, which is very, very important as far as aortic regurgitation is concerned. If you are grade 1 or 1+ or 2 echocardiographer, whatever the scenario is, put an emphasis on LV dilatation, vena contracta, holodiastolic reversal of flow in thoracic or descending aorta, along with LV dilatation. If we are a grade 3 echocardiologist, like we are working in a hospital, we have to give a final answer for surgical evaluation, spend time on other factors like vena contracta by transesophageal echocardiography. Then you can look at a stroke volume giving rise to regurgitant volumes. And even for eccentric AR jet, you can put an emphasis on transesophageal 3 dimensions vena contracta evaluations, or the area of the jet versus area of the LVOT by transthoracic, transesophageal 3 dimensions echocardiogram. And lastly, still you can take an help of cardiac MRI if it requires.
If it is an eccentric jet, the measurement of vena contracta is a problem in parasternal long axis because we have to go laterally. So in this case, I think, sir, quantitative measurement will help, like the stroke volume across the mitral valve and stroke volume across the aortic valve. And then we can measure the regurgitant volume, also measurements are going to help us. Yes. The next question, do we also underestimate aortic regurgitation in moderate to severe MS? I think you have already this.
We're not going to change anything for MS because the pressure half time will not take much difference. If the jet is impinging towards mitral valve leaflets, what will happen? The pressure half time would be shorter, overestimation. If the jet is away from mitral valve leaflets, it will take more time, so it will have a shorter pressure, mitral valve area. So whatever the scenario is in that cases, I'll say if you have MS with AR, spend time on planimetry of mitral stenosis. On AR side, spend time on vena contracta. And if you have a difficulty with vena contracta, spend time with stroke volume and other things.
So after MS now, a question on MR in the presence of MR. How can you assess severity of AR and LV dysfunction in presence of mitral regurgitation?
Deadly question. Somebody who has got an MR and AR, look, his outcome is very, very poor. So if you have an associated MR, the chances of doing the stroke volume, other things are gone away completely. You cannot assess on a stroke volumes. You cannot assess on other things. The only thing is you have to rely back on vena contracta, or you can rely on PISA method for looking at severity of aortic regurgitations. Said everything should be tried by a person. He should not spend only for one thing, like you look at a holodiastolic reversal of flow. You should try each and every method, because once it's needed, then you can really spend time on it. In my basic classes, I always say, if you have a situation of aortic regurgitation, always spend time on vena contracta. And if you have a multiple jets, calculate vena contracta from individual jet and sum them up. Because newer technology will have more problems in their calculations. Older technology, they're still like old time bosses are the best bosses. I still remember in my post-graduation, our boss gave 14 cases of IVPS to 14 PG. And you remember that time of 80s when we had no echocardiography? The boss used to ask the patient to sit down and get up. Mid-systolic click. 14 PG made 14 diagnoses, and subsequently everybody heard a mid-systolic click with systolic mark. So old parts of these evaluations are very good. Spend time on a vena contracta. Believe my words, many things would be solved when you're doing a vena contracta. LV dilatation and holodiastolic reversal of flow in descending aorta will give you to a large extent of people for diagnosis of severe aortic regurgitation.
The next question is measurement of pressure half time of AR in a patient with diastolic dysfunction, can it be done? The question is like that.
Patient with a diastolic dysfunction. Diastolic dysfunction means if he's talking of a grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, grade 4. What he's trying to ask is, if we have a high level of a diastolic dysfunction, what will happen to pressure half time? Obviously, it will be affected. There's no chance it's not going to be affected with raised LVDP if it's raised. So we have to take this point into consideration. Somebody asked the question, is it a measure for severity? No. But if you are putting LVDP as one of the parameters for assessing of pressure half time, obviously it will be affected. Like same thing, like if my LVDP is high, what will happen to my regurgitant flow? It will be less. Same will happen to pressure half time. So it will be altered if my LVDP would be high.
The next question is, how do we distinguish between the AR in this DCM and other pathology of aortic valve? So basically, presence of AR in dilated cardiomyopathy and other pathology of the aortic valve.
Well, what exactly we see annular dilatation? What exactly he means to say that whether annular dilatation giving rise to aortic regurgitation? If we have a dilated LV, as far as I believe, whatever the things will have, dilated LV will not affect much to aortic valve dilatation. Dilatic LV will affect more to mitral valve or mitral annulus dilatations. Aortic valve pathology will have aortic dilatation giving rise to non-coaptation of aortic valve. And dilated cardiomyopathy, you can have some amount of aortic regurgitations.
And that is why we have to look very carefully to the aortic sinuses and the proximal aspect of the aorta as much as possible. Find out the pathology over there, the cause of aortic regurgitation.
Correct.
The next question. In transesophageal echo, if you are not properly aligned to the jet, so difficult to assess. I didn't understand the question, sir, properly. So
his question must be like in transesophageal, transthoracic or transesophageal?
Transesophageal, TEE.
In transesophageal echo, if we are not properly aligned, we cannot estimate the vena contract. That possibly must be the answer is go to 110 degree, 120, 110, 120 degree.
Or we can go to the transgastric view.
Transgastric view also.
Transgastric at 0 degree with anti-flexed, fully anti-flexed probe, or at 120 degree in mid-transgastric. These are the
mid-transesophageal, like what I normally do is mid-transesophageal view. At 110, 120 degree, I'm able to see a very good vena contract.
Vena contract, right, sir? Yes. Or yeah, if we want to align the jet with the cursor of continuous wave Doppler, then we have to go to the transgastric.
Transgastric.
So the next question: severe calcification in the aortic valve. How to take measurements in this scenario? Dr. Sanjeevani has asked this question.
Dr. Sanjeevani Namdar from Pune. If you have a severe calcification of aortic valve, that's right?
Yes, sir. How to take the measurements in this scenario? It's real difficult question.
No, not difficult question. It all depends severe calcification of, if she is talking of aortic valve as one of the reason, that we do not put emphasis on vena contract. It will be difficult for us.
No, sir. I think Dr. Sanjeevani is trying to ask how to take the measurements when there is calcification in the aortic root. Like in calcific aortic valve diseases, often we find difficult to find out the hinge point because of presence of calcification. Maybe
so how do you measure the aortic root dilatation? So Dr. Sanjeevani, everything is not in the domain of echocardiography. Switch over to cardiac CT. That's what the issue is. Like many people who are doing tower, they are not putting emphasis more on a echocardiography on this particular measurements. If you have a severe calcification, obviously whenever we are measuring the aortic root, it will be erroneous. Switch over to cardiac CT or cardiac MRI.
So we have come to the last question. The last question is color M mode versus pulse wave Doppler in holodiastolic flow reversal. Which one is better, sort of? And he or she wants to know.
Both are good. Pulse Doppler will give you a VTI as well as end diastolic velocity. Color M mode will give you the duration of reversal flow. By color M mode, you can say whether it's holodiastolic or early diastolic or mid diastolics. But if you do a quantitative estimation, that will be more appropriate for calculation of by end diastolic and VTI. And if I were you, I'll not ask this question. You should say that, sir, we should do both color mode at descending aorta to assess holodiastolic flow and to measure by pulse Doppler to assess end diastolic and a VTI. So both are the good, they are complement to each other, and you should do both of them.
So that was the last question. Do you want to add anything more, sir? Dr. Gupta?
I only want to say only one thing is, please, for God's sake, do not do echo like a postal stamp departments. Well, all of us knows that we have a large volume of work when we are doing in hospitals. But when we see a patient who needs a real evaluation, give that patient certain time when you are comfortable and easy to evaluate. Many patients, they come back to you when they have looked at certain parameter which is talking of severe, certain parameter talking of moderate, and patient has been labeled as moderate aortic regurgitation and being sent home, coming back again with severity of that particular lesion. And when we look at those kind of things earlier, some of the report shows that patient was already in severe aortic regurgitations. That's one important. Second is, please utilize their newer modalities like stress or strain imaging for assessment of their severity and prognostic values as well. And once you are able to see these kind of things, and you have to persuade these people to go for early surgery. And one of the editor has very categorically said these words in Journal of American College of Cardiology. Look, you should have images with you to tell to your patient, look, this is what the severe aortic regurgitation you have. And if you get your surgery done at this particular time, you'll have a survival as good as a normal subject. So answer is, like, we should be proactively working more in those subjects where the indication is really to differentiate between intervention versus non-intervention. I can quote very simple example. It was about 2 years back. One patient came to me with the uncontrolled blood pressure, 2 surgery done for nasal epistaxis, 1 surgery done for renal stones, and his blood pressure was still uncontrolled. And look at his history. He says, sir, whenever I take my antihypertensive drug, my blood pressure gets controlled, but it's very difficult for me to walk around. We did an echo. Echo was normal. Only thing, he was having a left ventricular hypertrophy. And now everybody can say because of hypertension, he had a left ventricular hypertrophy. I said, no, let's look at his descending aorta. Let's look at his thoracic aorta. We saw the descending aorta, flow was not there, very minimal flow was there. And in the thoracic aorta, we could show a classical coactation of aorta. I always remember the word of Dr. Parashar. He always say, look at the WHY syndrome. Why these things are there? And when you start putting Y syndrome into the practice, your diagnoses are much more appropriate and clear. So that's what my take-home message is. And don't hold a patient. Suppose you don't have a 3 dimensions echo with you and the patient needs a 3-dimensional echo. Send him for 3D echo or cardiac MRI or transesophageal echo. Whatever you have in an armamentarium, just write it clearly. So this is what is there. Rest I could not see. And rest, because once he goes to next doctor, he always understand, look, this was seen by the person earlier and he could not see this. That's what my take-home message is. And practice regularly whenever you get aortic regurgitation. Practice all points regularly. That's what will help you in coming out and perfect diagnosis.
Okay, I think we have come to the end. Thanks, audience, for the great questions. We have had a very fruitful discussion today, and I'm sure it has given us a lot of food for thought. Once again, I would like to thank the Indian Academy of Echocardiography for organizing this webinar. And I would also like to thank Dr. Rakesh Gupta for sharing his valuable thoughts with us. Thanks everyone once again for tuning in, and I hope you will join us for more sessions of Indian Academy of Echocardiography like this. And that's all from my side today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Debika, and thank you very much everybody for tuning into this I channel for echocardiography. Stay tuned for our next session, which is going to come very shortly. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time. Thank you very much, everybody.